Excellent. Okay, thank you. We've just had one more person enter. Welcome. You haven't missed anything yet. Fantastic. Okay, so I wanted to start off this lesson by touching back on the language style last week and also a little bit on form, because the form of Ray Bradbury's The Pedestrian is really important as well. But let's first start with the language style. So this was the reading task for last week's lesson. And I think we'll focus just very briefly before we jump into the text and the next step in the literary analysis process, which is narrative voice. I want to focus on the tone, the mood, and figurative language as aspects of the language style that are really important for this narrative. First up, I just wanted you to think about, while we're reading The Pedestrian, how Bradbury uses language to create a certain tone to convey his cynical attitude towards what is being observed in this society. So a little heads up, the story is dystopian. Can someone just, whoever is, just mute yourself there, and then we won't hear the background noise. Thank you. It's dystopian, it's science fiction, it's a short story, and it's satire. So it has a very distinctive mood, and Bradbury has a very, being satire especially, Bradbury has a very clear, cynical perspective that is put through in the tone that is created in the short story. So think about Bradbury's attitudes towards what is being observed in this dystopian society. And by dystopian, I mean it's a future projection of a not so savoury and favourable future world. And so how does he create that? And how do we get that sense of, that cynicism and the fact that he is, quite intentionally picking apart this world where people are just so sucked into their television screens that they're losing their humanity? How does he convey that? And then the mood, there's a really distinct sense of isolation, coldness, bleakness. And we get the sense that the main character, Leonard Mead, is very disillusioned with this reality. So how is that constructed? How is that very clear mood created using language? That's what we'll chat about today as well. And then the other aspect that's really important when we're thinking about the language style for this text is figurative language. You'll notice that it's prose, so it's written it's using a lot of metaphors, similes, personification, imagery. It's quite an image-driven piece. So we'll also look at those elements as well. So if you haven't read this, this is in last week's. This is step 4 in the literary analysis in 10 steps. Feel free to go back through this, and it breaks down all of the different aspects of, of the language style that you can look for in a text. I've just pointed out the ones that are going to be most relevant to the text today, though. But yeah, feel free to read this. Go back if you haven't. Diction, register, all of those things that we can look for, syntax, sentence structure. So yeah, go back if you need to, but let's move into narrative voice. And before I dive into this lesson's step, which is step 5, narrative voice, I just want to quickly go back to the week before that, lesson 3, because that's when we looked at textual form. So the medium, it's the type of text that the writer has chosen to use as their vehicle for communicating their messages. So for this one, as I said, we're going to look at the fact that it is science fiction. It's a dystopia. It's a short story. It's written in prose. And these are all aspects of the textual form that are going to give us really strong clues about the types of things that we can analyze in the short story. So keep those in mind as well. But let's have a look at this week's reading task. So it's not overly long. It's 13 pages. It might take you, say, 10 minutes to read. I'll just quickly walk you through what it contains. So it gives an introduction to narrative voice, just here, the different types of narrative voices. And then I've provided a breakdown of the common types of narrative voice. So we've got first-person voice, different types of first-person voice as well. So homodiegetic voice, it's a particular type of first-person narration. Autodiegetic, so we've got the definition and then a breakdown. So please read about this this week. Second person, when the narrator is speaking directly to the reader, directly addressing them. Third person voice, and then a few different types of third person voice. So close third person voice, where we get more of an insight into the protagonist's mindset. Close third person usually follows, even though we're getting the he, she, they, it provides us a more deeper insight into the thoughts and feelings of usually one character, and we get to know them fairly well. The examples I've given here are Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet. The story's told in third person, but we really get to know her character quite intimately. And then we looked at 1984 a few weeks ago, and then similar thing, we're really closely following the protagonist, Winston Smith, but we're kept a little bit at arm's distance, because it's not first person, but we're still getting insight into his inner thoughts and feelings. In contrast, like the text today, The Pedestrian, which is written in third person omniscient narration, this is sort of a bit more of an all-seeing, all-knowing narrator. And so it's often used in dystopia and sci-fi because there's more world building that goes on in these genres. So the author often needs to create a sense of the society as a whole and how it functions. And so third person omniscient, where you're not limited by one character's perspective, allows that broader lens. And so we'll look at how today Bradbury in particular uses that third person omniscient to do a few things, to set up that world where we're looking at that through that broader lens, this society, this dystopia he's constructed. And then we will also look at how he still provides insight into Leonard Mead's inner thoughts and feelings as well. So we sort of go, into the mind, and then we sort of, move back, the lens moves in and out quite easily with that omniscient narration. So I've got a breakdown of that in more detail as well. A few examples there, like Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia are really popular ones. Then I've given a breakdown of some of the common types of third person, heterodiegetic narration. You may or may not have heard of some of these more specific ones. Often you learn about these when you study narratology. I used to teach a year 11 course where we broke down narratology devices. And so we delved a little bit more into these different types. So I thought I'd include them because it is helpful to go beyond those, often students, especially in high school, find it difficult to go beyond the first, second, third narration. A lot of people just think, oh yeah, there's 3 types, but there's actually a lot of different ways that authors can choose to present a story. Stream of consciousness is another example where the narration is almost like following the flow of thought, and it can be quite stop-start, haphazard. The way it mimics the way we think, and the way that, sometimes our thoughts are very, interrupted, and we'll go in this direction and that direction. It was a type of narrative style that a lot of writers adopted in the modernist era. So James Joyce is a classic example. If we have a quick look at this example, wood shadows floated silently through the morning peace from the stairhead seaward where he gazed, inshore and farther out the mirror of water whitened, spurned by light shod hurrying feet, white breast of the dim sea. Short, sharp sentences, sometimes like little bursts of imagery from the perspective of a character as though we're inside their mind. And then let's have the one from Mrs. Dalloway is probably a better example, actually, because there's a lot of that stopping and starting and pausing. An unreliable narrator. I love an unreliable narrator. It's like they're telling the story and you can't trust them, but they're the ones telling the story. So you have no choice but to, follow their story, and you doubt them and you question them. It's sort of a fun reading experience to me. And you don't even, sometimes an unreliable narrator, they're untrustworthy and sometimes even unlikable. You can see that, often their morals are a little bit skewed, but it's, often they're quite endearing as well. So I've put a few examples there from The Catcher in the Rye is a really classic one, American Psycho, obviously, where characters have some kind of mental instability, some kind of madness. You'll find them unreliable. And then epistolary is another classic one. You can read up on that. Frankenstein is a really good example. It's where they write in letters, or, you know, they intersperse other forms of texts into the narrative as well. So it could be newspaper clippings. The True History of the Kelly Gang by Peter Carey is another example that comes to mind, where it's letters written from the perspective of Ned Kelly, and in his voice. Often these letters, because they're first person letters, there's a really distinctive, authentic voice, usually with a really clear dialect, a lot of colloquial language. You know, it might really show the persona's level of education, where they're from, their culture, and all of that. So they can be quite an interesting read as well. Stories told from multiple perspectives. Game of Thrones is a really, you know, a modern one that comes to mind. Juliana Baggett's Pure series, where you know, you're following one character and you're in their perspective, and then the next chapter might be from the perspective of another character. Sometimes there might be multiple characters, sometimes 2 or 3, particularly in young adult fiction. That's more common, just to have a couple that you move between. So they can make for interesting reading as well. So yeah, read up on those. Frame narratives. Heart of Darkness I love Heart of Darkness. I will probably teach that at some point as well. So yeah, go through that. This is the reading for this week. I hope you find it helpful somewhat in just going that extra step beyond the conventional first, second, third, because there's a lot more to the narrative voice and the choices that a writer can make, and that you can make when you're, you know, writing your own creative pieces, for making your writing and the voices that you're creating in your texts, you know, a lot more interesting and engaging for the reader. Okay, so let's dive into the Pedestrian. Okay, as I said, it's a little bit long. It's not quite 4 pages, but yeah, I won't rush it too much, but hopefully it won't take too much longer than last week's reading. Okay. To enter out into that silence that was the city at 8 o'clock of a misty evening in November, to put your feet upon the buckling concrete walk, to step over grassy seams and make your way, hands in pockets, through the silences. Oh, hang on, let me just admit someone here. That was what Mr. Leonard Mead most dearly loved to do. He would stand upon the corner of an intersection and peer down long moonlit avenues of sidewalk in 4 directions, deciding which way to go, but it really made no difference. He was alone in this world of AD 2053, or as good as alone, and with a final decision made, a path selected, he would stride off, sending patterns of frosty air before him like the smoke of a cigar. Sometimes he would walk for hours and miles and return only at midnight to his house. And on his way, he would see the cottages and homes with their dark windows, and it was not unequal to walking through a graveyard where only the faintest glimmers of firefly light appeared in flickers behind the windows. Sudden grey phantoms seemed to manifest upon inner room walls where a curtain was still undrawn against the night, or there were whisperings and murmurs where a window in a tomb-like building was still open. Mr. Leonard Mead would pause, cock his head, listen, look, and march on, his feet making no noise on the lumpy walk. For long ago, he had wisely changed to sneakers when strolling at night, because the dogs in intermittent squads would parallel his journey with barkings if he wore hard heels, and lights might click on and faces appear, and an entire street be startled by the passing of a lone figure, himself in the early November evening. On this particular evening, he began his journey in a westerly direction toward the hidden sea. There was a good crystal frost in the air. It cut the nose and made the lungs blaze like a Christmas tree inside. You could feel the cold light going on and off, all the branches filled with invisible snow. He listened to the faint push of his soft shoes through autumn leaves with satisfaction, and whistled a cold, quiet whistle between his teeth, occasionally picking up a leaf as he passed, examining its skeletal pattern in the infrequent lamplights as he went on, smelling its rusty smell. Hello in there, he whispered to every house on every side as he moved. What's up tonight on Channel 4, Channel 7, Channel 9? Where are the cowboys rushing? And do I see the United States cavalry over the next hill to the rescue? The street was silent and long and empty, with only his shadow moving like the shadow of a hawk in mid-country. If he closed his eyes and stood very still, frozen, he could imagine himself upon the centre of a plain, A wintry, windless Arizona desert with no house in 1,000 miles and only dry riverbeds, the streets for company. What is it now? He asked the houses, noticing his wristwatch. 8:30 p.m. Time for a dozen assorted murders, a quiz, a review, a comedian falling off the stage. Was that a murmur of laughter from within a moon-white house? He hesitated, but went on when nothing more happened. He stumbled over a particularly uneven section of sidewalk. The cement was vanishing under the flowers and grass. In 10 years of walking by day or night, for thousands of miles, he had never met another person walking, not once in all that time. He came to a cloverleaf intersection which stood silent where two main highways crossed the town. During the day, it was a thunderous surge of cars, the gas stations open, a great insect rustling and a ceaseless jockeying for position as the scarab beetles, a faint incense puttering from their exhausts, skimmed homeward to the far directions. But now these highways too were like streams in a dry season, all stone and bed and moon radiance. He turned back on, someone's unmuted, you can just hear a little bit of sound there. He turned back on a side street, circling around toward his home. He was within a block of his destination when the lone car turned a corner quite suddenly and flashed a fierce white cone of light upon him. He stood, entranced, not unlike a night moth, stunned by the illumination and then drawn toward it. A metallic voice called to him, "Stand still, stay where you are, don't move." He halted. "Put your hands up." "But," he said, "your hands up or we'll shoot." The police, of course, but what a rare, incredible thing. In a city of 3 million, there was only one police car left. Wasn't that correct? Ever since a year ago, 2052, the election year, the force had been cut down from 3 cars to 1. Crime was ebbing. There was no need now for the police, save for this one lone car wandering the empty streets. "Your name?" said the police car in a metallic whisper. He couldn't see the men in it for the bright lights in his eyes. "Leonard Mead," he said. "Speak up." "Leonard Mead." "Business or profession?" "I guess you'd call me a writer." "No profession," said the police car, as if talking to itself. The light held him fixed, like a museum specimen, needle thrust through chest. "You might say that," said Mr. Mead. He hadn't written in years. Magazines and books didn't sell anymore. Everything went on in the tomb-like houses at night now, he thought, continuing his fancy. The tombs, ill-lit by television light, where people sat like the dead, the grey, or multicoloured lights touching their faces, but never really touching them. "No profession," said the phonograph voice hissing. "What are you doing out?" "Walking," said Leonard Mead. "Walking." "Just walking," he said simply, but his face felt cold. "Walking? Just walking. Walking?" "Yes, sir. Walking where? For what?" Walking for air. Walking to sea." "Your address?" 11 South St. James Street. "And there is air in your house? You have an air conditioner, Mr. Mead?" "Yes." "And you have a viewing screen in your house to see with?" "No." "No?" There was a crackling quiet that in itself was an accusation. "Are you married, Mr. Mead?" "No." "Not married," said the police voice behind the fiery beam. The moon was high and clear among the stars, and the houses were grey and silent. "Nobody wanted me," said Mr. Leonard Mead with a smile. "Don't speak unless you're spoken to." Leonard Mead waited in the cold night. "Just walking, Mr. Mead." "Yes." "But you haven't explained for what purpose." "I explained. For air and to see and just to walk." "Have you done this often?" "Every night for years." The police car sat in the centre of the street with its radio throat faintly humming. "Well, Mr. Mead," it said. "Is that all?" he asked politely. "Yes," said the voice. "Here." There was a sigh, a pop. The back door of the police car sprang wide. "Get in." "Wait a minute, I haven't done anything." "Get in." "I protest." "Mr. Mead." He walked like a man suddenly drunk. As he passed the front window of the car, he looked in. As he had expected, there was no one in the front seat, no one in the car at all. "Get in." He put his hand to the door and peered into the back seat, which was a little cell, a little black jail with bars. It smelled of riveted steel. It smelled of harsh antiseptic. It smelled too clean and hard and metallic. There was nothing soft there. Now, if you had a wife to give you an alibi, said the iron voice, but where are you taking me? The car hesitated, or rather gave a faint whirring click as if information somewhere was dropping card by punch-slotted card under electric eyes. To the Psychiatric Centre for Research on Regressive Tendencies. He got in. The door shut with a soft thud. The police car rolled through the night avenues, flashing its dim lights ahead. They passed one house on one street a moment later, one house in an entire city of houses that were dark. But this one particular house had all of its electric lights brightly lit, every window a loud yellow illumination, square and warm in the cool darkness. That's my house, said Leonard Mead. No one answered him. The car moved down the empty riverbed streets and off away, leaving the empty streets with the empty sidewalks and no sound and no motion, all the rest of the chill November night. Okay, the end. So that's the whole short story. It's nice we can actually fit in a whole text. I didn't want to just do an extract. So I guess I would like to get your impressions first and foremost, just coming across to the 10-step analysis of the text. Any thoughts on what you think his messages, purpose, his intended audience, or what he values might be? His context, while you're thinking, feel free to put it into the chat or even just verbally, put your hand up and feel free to speak. But I'll give a little while you're thinking and just having, and also feel free to give your own personal interpretation. Is there anything that you think, any ways that you think this story is still relevant for us today? Or, could it be still used as a critique of our own society, a very technologically saturated society in the 21st century? So yeah, open to any personal interpretations and anything that would work for this first page. Context, purpose, audience, values, personal interpretations that make it relevant to our context. Give you some time for thinking, and while you're thinking and typing away there in the comments, I'm just going to put in a few details here. So I found it interesting that in 1949, Bradbury was actually walking through the streets of LA, and a policeman stopped him and asked him what he was doing, because it wasn't an area that was, there wasn't a lot of pedestrians in that area. And he said to the police officer in response, well, he was walking with a friend, well, we're just putting one foot in front of the other. And the policeman really didn't like this joke. He thought that Bradbury was, being smart, and it didn't go down very well with the police officer. Bradbury himself really didn't like the fact that he was just exercising his right to, be free and to walk around the city as he chose, and that he was being viewed with this sort of, scrutiny by an authority figure. So that was part of the, I guess, the personal experience, the personal context that shaped this story. So I'll just put in here personal context. Bradbury's own experience with the police officer. It was written and published in 1951, so that might also give you some clues about what was going on. Remember, if you were here when we were talking about the Crucible, early 1950s, similar climate. There's a lot of the Cold War, there's a lot of changes going on, a lot of political turmoil, instability, and people were really questioning the government, questioning the way that society was constructed. So you can think about that 1950s context as well. And also, technology was making its way into people's houses like never before in the form of television. Any thoughts on what his messages might be, people? Anyone got any ideas on what is the point of that story? What is he trying to tell us? What is he trying to awaken us to, or his audience to?
I think it's a critique on totalitarianism and restrictions of freedoms.
Yeah, I think so too, very much. Critique of Yeah, those sort of totalitarian forms of governance or authority, and the loss of freedom that they bring. Yeah, thanks, Michael. Fantastic. Maybe we can build on that. Intended audience. I'm just going to, so obviously, yeah, let's skip down to what does he value? What do you think he's wanting us to, we can see what he's critiquing. I think he's critiquing the loss of humanity that comes about when humans are so consumed by technology, and the fact that they're losing their, what makes them human. And this is a trope in science fiction literature as well, and quite often in dystopian fiction. We see that, in constructing this dystopian world where people are, a new, oh, hang on, let me open the chat. There's more happening in here. Yes, okay. We've got themselves, yeah, the police butt themselves in other people's business. Yeah, freedom. Yeah, thanks, Imogen. Yeah, absolutely, freedom. Oops, I'm going to pop that in here. Freedom, individuality, autonomy, agency. Absolutely. Okay, so let's go down to the big ideas. So if we're going to think about what we think his story is about, and what are some of the big ideas that we can analyze there? So if you had to, in a nutshell, say, okay, this is what the narrative is about, what would you say? How could you sort of distill it down into a key message that you think he's trying? So let me just also skip across to the focus question while you're thinking about that. The focus question for this week and for this text is, how does Bradbury's The Pedestrian engage readers in social commentary on human behaviours? Okay, so social commentary on human behaviours. I've intentionally kept that a little bit broad, and I'll give you an example here of the topic sentence that I've given. Bradbury's The Pedestrian effectively engages readers in social commentary on human behaviours through its depiction of a society consumed by technology and conformity. So there's a little bit of an idea there. Any other big ideas that come to mind if you were going to answer that question about what Michael has given some really great ideas there for what he is commentating on, what is the critique of. And so yeah, have a think about that, because there's a few big ideas that come to my mind. I think as a character, and also Bradbury as a writer, very disillusioned with the idea that technology, the combination of the government and technology, and the way that a government can abuse technology or use it to gain even more power and control over the populace, in a way that sort of enslaves them to technology. That's a real threat to humanity. And I think this is a big idea that Bradbury is trying to convey to us. It is, the dangers, I'm going to put this down here, of authorities seizing technology as a vehicle for social control and manipulation. And so if we think about how he's using the narrative as a vehicle of political protest and social protest, and how he's using it to critique these dangers, and from his observations of previous governments as well. I mean, this is written in the early 1950s, straight after post-World War II, in the aftermath of, as Michael mentioned, those totalitarian regimes. So it is a very real threat. Here you've had these governments, like we spoke about when we, if you were there for the 1984 George Orwell lesson, where you've got writers and thinkers and the population really still quite shaken by just how much control the Nazi regimes and Stalinist Russia, how much those governments were able to intrude into the freedoms of the individual in those societies. So the idea that these technologies are now, entering people's homes, and the same with the telescreens in 1984, we're seeing how these very real fears and threats are making their way into the psyche of the populace. Important to consider conventions and authority in order to keep the government in check. Yeah, absolutely. Important to question. Thanks for that, Megan. I'll add in their social conventions and authority to keep the government in check. Yeah, absolutely. And this is exactly what Bradbury and Orwell are both doing. They're questioning these social constructs and these forms of authority that are a threat to human freedom, exposing threats to human freedoms and also human nature. I mean, yes, we've got people that are enslaved by these technological devices. Their imaginations, their emotions are completely absorbed in these devices to the point where they're like the dead. It's quite, we see a lot of that repeated imagery of the houses as tombs. These people are dead well before they're buried in this story. And that, I think, is quite confronting as a reader, to read that these people are grey and corpse-like, sitting in their houses with this artificial light, flickering in their homes. And then there's one solitary person, Leonard Mead, who is committing a crime just by the very act of walking. This is satire at its best, I think. So when you're coming to write this paragraph, or there's a creative response for this text as well, think about how he, confronts the reader with these quite graphic images, and almost like, when I was reading it, I was thinking, oh gosh, the amount of time I sit on my laptop, I'm working and I'm doing something meaningful, but he sort of puts us in the lens of observing people absorbed in technology. And, if you actually could see yourself, watching Netflix or scrolling through, you're actually not doing anything. Yes, your mind is captivated, and you're so absorbed in what you're doing, and it feels meaningful. Sometimes it doesn't actually. The dreaded doom scrolling trap that lots of people talk about on social media. But, I think these are the things that make this text applicable to us now. That idea that, are we falling into that trap, when we become so absorbed in these online platforms or TV, these forms of entertainment where our physical body is really just sitting there staring at a screen. And that was, for me, part of the shock factor of reading this text. And I think that is, really relevant more than ever, when we think about just how pervasive these forms of technology and the way we communicate as well. A lot of even what we're doing now, I'm just sitting here in a room talking to people through a screen. What are we losing in doing that? Yes, I can reach people, for example, in, that I would never be able to teach in person. There are definitely advantages, but what are the disadvantages? Think about when you're writing about this text or thinking about this text, of what are we losing? And I think that's a big part of, what is lost when humanity relies too heavily on technology. And what is it about, technology as a potential vehicle for social control, to strip people of the things that make them human, that make them more easy to manipulate and more easy, makes them, easier to make them conform to the social conventions as well. Okay, so there's some big ideas. Feel free to obviously add your own. I'll upload this analysis document with our notes from today's lesson on it, but also feel free to do this activity on your own using this PDF, which is in your lesson materials as well. Textual form, as I said, it's a dystopia. It's a science fiction. It is prose, a prose narrative. It is satire. So these are all different types of texts, all have their own sub-conventions. Dystopias usually have a dystopian protagonist. Here we've got Leonard, who is the rebel by walking the streets at night on his own, thinking about nature. I mean, we get a lot of that sense of the tension between what's happening inside the houses, people absorbed in, imagery of war. I think they mentioned the cavalry. Murders, his question, game shows. And so it's either war and violence, ironically, in a society where crime has been almost eradicated to the point where they don't need an actual police force because people are just inside their homes. And you've also got Leonard Mead, who is a character who, he's out in nature. He doesn't want to breathe in air-conditioned air. When the police officer questions him, don't you have an air conditioner? Because he's saying, I'm walking for the air and to see. Don't you have a screen in your home? And so, this is a very unique type of dystopia where, it's a world. If we're thinking about this distinctive dystopian world and what makes it distinctive, it's a world where human freedoms of communing in nature, walking, breathing in fresh air, are actually outlawed. As the story reveals, they're not just, that doesn't just make Leonard Mead different and an outsider. He's certainly an outsider and a voyeur looking in on other people's lives, but he's actually, it's illegal. He gets picked up by the police and is arrested, and taken to like a centre where he will be studied and hopefully, rehabilitated to re-enter society. I mean, it's an ambiguous ending, but that's an interpretation of what you could assume happens to him, to be sort of reprogrammed to slot back into this society where he no longer desires to be out in nature, walking and breathing in fresh air. This text actually, interestingly, was really heavily studied, was put back on the curriculum, especially in the US during COVID. So if you think about the parallels between, lockdowns and people going from living, quite free lives where going for a walk outside, breathing in fresh air was in no way restricted, to then having those freedoms stripped away. And so reading this text in that context actually was quite confronting for a lot of people as well. This short story sort of had a resurgence in popularity at that time, because there were some strong parallels as well as just, when there's a situation in a society or across the world, really, the pandemic, where governments suddenly have the ability or the license to make those kinds of decisions on behalf of the people, to restrict those individual freedoms as well. The fact that it's sci-fi, similar to 1984, here we have technological devices being used as forms of social manipulation. It's prose. We're going to dive into that in a sec. I feel like I've spoken about the fact that it is social critique, social commentary. Make sure if you answer this question that you talk about the fact that it's satire, a biting, ridiculing of this type of society and governmental control. Okay, let's go back to the text itself, because I would like to pick it apart in terms of the narrative voice, figurative language, characterization, and dialogue are all really important for this text. And then also layers of symbolism. I want to also point out a few of the symbols, the houses as tombs, people as living as the dead. These are quite strong graphic symbols, as I mentioned. Have a look as well at that tension between the contrast between light and dark as symbols. The fact that Leonard's house is lit up like a Christmas tree at the end, and then all the other houses are dark, he sort of becomes this symbol of, you know, warmth and humanity in an otherwise quite dark and desolate place, devoid of humanity. The tension as well, the conflict between cold and warmth as well. There's a lot of coldness and bleakness in the story, and that's symbolic as well. We've got as well the police car as a symbol of authority, and we've got Leonard himself as a symbol, as a symbolic character, really, you know, who really embodies that desire for individual freedom, autonomy, agency, as we spoke about. And let's look at the imagery as well. Metaphor, similes, personification. These are all the important parts of this story. Not so much this, yes, contrast. I just mentioned lots of different types of contrast. Irony, really important. It's such an ironic tone throughout this whole thing. You know, it's also ironic that Mead's little, you know, resistance of going for a walk, and his individuality is seen as a form of madness, a form of insanity. I'll just put here Mead's insanity, and I'll elaborate on that later before I re-upload this. But I think as well, in when we're thinking about science fiction and dystopian texts, quite often, if we have a protagonist that is seen, or a sub-character that is seen as mad by that society, you know, John the Savage in Brave New World, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is another example that comes to mind. He's seen as mad, and so is Leonard Mead here. And usually, you know, madness is a really good indicator of where the boundaries are in that society, and what the social expectations are. Because as soon as someone is perceived as mad, when we look at their behavior, their patterns of thinking and behaving, you know, we see what that society and what the authorities expect people to do and not do. So sometimes, you know, characters that are seen as insane, they might not be the protagonist. Sometimes they're a foil for that society. And by foil, I mean they present a form of contrast to the social expectations, and the fact that authority figures or other people in that society are going, this person is insane. It kind of gives us an indicator of where those boundaries lie. So I find studying madness, insanity in literature really fascinating for that reason, because if you didn't have that foil character or that mad character, then you wouldn't so easily see where those social boundaries are. So think about that as well, when you're analysing this text. So let's go back to the Pedestrian, and let's just take a look at some of these things. So if we're looking at the repetition of, you know, the coldness here, there's patterns of frosty air, this sort of imagery you can point out where it builds and builds, the imagery of the graveyard, where only the faintest glimmers of firefly light appeared in flickers behind the windows. So that's that artificial television light. Sudden grey phantoms seem to manifest upon inner room walls. So that's the people moving inside the house. Again, they're not really human here. So this, you know, visual imagery is interesting as well in setting up these people inside the houses, inside these tombs, as, you know, as not human. They're already dead. And then we've got here as well, he's changed his shoes. He used to have leather shoes, but they would click clack on the footpaths and set off the dogs because they weren't used to, you know, people walking around. So this sort of accentuates as well his loneliness and his outsider status. Now he's almost skulking around, trying not to draw attention, as, you know, to himself as this sort of shadowy figure on the periphery of this society, you know, as a voyeur looking into people's homes. And then we get as well more of this cold imagery. There was a good crystal frost in the air. It cut the nose and made the lungs blaze like a Christmas tree inside. Not a comfortable scene, but he would prefer this. It is this kind of discomfort and this cold to being inside the warmth of the house. You know, it makes him feel alive. We get a sense that this is probably the only living, breathing person in this whole society, in this whole world. And he seems to like that feeling of feeling like he's being, you know, vitalized and invigorated by the cold weather. A lot of imagery here as well. He listened to the faint push of his soft shoes through autumn leaves with satisfaction and whistled a cold, quiet whistle between his teeth. He's enjoying the cold. I sense that he likes being out there. I mean, he's isolated, he's alone. He's very, very lonely, obviously, in this world, but I don't get the sense that he would very much rather be outside. And this is where I was saying before, he starts to question the houses. So personification here, he's talking to the houses as though they are living entities. So that rather than the people inside being living, breathing entities, we've got the houses, whispered to every house. What's on the TV? So this is this sardonic, ironic tone here. We're getting this, if you're thinking about the tone of the voice in this through Leonard's voice, we're getting that sense of cynicism. He's very, critical of what people are doing. The fact that they're, watching wars and when it comes down here, 8:30 p.m, time for a dozen assorted murders. The mention of the time as well. This is the government, the authorities are also able to quite heavily structure people's lives into these routines based around, at 8:30 they're watching this, at this time they're watching this. And so that's also, a bit of a critique as well of, the way that the government is able to order people's time. Any observations from you so far on any of this? Does anybody, what have you found, if anything, striking about this short story? I'll take a pause here. Anything that I've just introduced so far, anything that made you think? Anything that made you go, oh, that was interesting, or that, a particularly striking line? Anything about the mood or the tone? It's okay if nothing. I just wanted to pause and give you a moment to think. Otherwise, I'll just be talking at you the whole time, which I'm happy to do, but I also want to give you a chance to contribute as well. I don't want to bombard you with too many words all in one hit. All good? Okay, if anything pops into your mind or you want me to pause and talk about a particular example, then yeah, feel free to interrupt me, please. Yeah, the dryness. What do you make of that? Is there anything that what would you interpret with the dryness? That's something I haven't really, even the autumn leaves, it is a dry season. And the fact that it is like, it's frozen, the center of a plain, it's wintry, there's a desert. And even if we come down a little bit to the Clover intersection, now these highways too, yeah, emptiness, absolutely. These highways too are like streams in a dry season, all stone and bed and moon radiance. Yeah, emptiness, it's sapped of life. There's no life and vitality in this place. It's interesting that when he closes his eyes, his instinct is to still picture the Arizona desert. If he closed his eyes and stood very still, frozen, he could imagine himself upon the center of a plain, a wintry, windless Arizona desert with no house in 1,000 miles and only dry riverbeds, the streets for company. This builds his character into somebody that really has a reverence for nature. Yes, he's alone, but he would prefer that than to surrendering himself to what everybody else is doing. So he really does have this natural affinity with nature, and that might speak to the fact that he sees himself as a writer as well, which is sort of symbolic as his also his reverence for the human imagination. So he's clinging on to the things that make humans human in this world, even though he hasn't written for a long time. There's no longer a place for books and magazines. They've been replaced by televisions, which, what does that say? What does it say in a society where there's no longer a place for books and magazines? What's the difference between the process of reading a book or a magazine and viewing something on a TV? You know, what do we lose when we only have one form of entertainment? You know, I think there is the symbolism of books and, you know, literature and magazines as when you're interacting with that kind of written text, it's igniting your imagination. You have to do more thinking to fill in the gaps. We have to visualize. When we're viewing something, a lot of that process has been done for us. And it's like, you know, when you read a book and then you watch the film version or the television version, and you think, oh gosh, that's not how I envisioned that. Or I didn't see that character in that way, or oh, it's a different world to what I envisioned. You know, that's the power of reading as well, as opposed to just viewing something, is you have that opportunity to construct. You're sort of meeting the writer halfway as the reader, you know, and they're igniting your imagination so that you have the opportunity. I think it's an opportunity to build something together. But when really what you're getting when you're viewing something as well is you're getting someone else's vision of that text, of that script, or of that book, or, you know, whatever it might be. So I think too, that's sort of what Bradbury's pointing to. And if you read his other work, Fahrenheit 451, where the authorities burn all the books, you know, this is something that he's really passionate about. And obviously Bradbury is a writer in real life, and he has this, you know, ex-writer in his protagonist here, Leonard Mead. So when you're thinking about for the focus question for this text and how you can analyze, I think characterization of Leonard Mead, and, you know, that contrast between, you know, who he is as a character, what he represents, what he values, you know, in contrast to what everybody else is doing in this, you know, what this society values, that tension between the individual and the society is you know, you could write a paragraph just about that tension and you know, what Bradbury is pointing to about what is lost, you know, when we take these things away. It has a lot of parallels, I think, to 1984 as well. There's so many moments where I think, oh, that's similar to, you know, what Orwell was getting at, and they're writing at the same time. You could easily write an essay on 1984 and Bradbury and what they're both doing. Okay, a little bit of a spiel, went off on a bit of a tangent there, but yeah, this is my jam, dystopia. My PhD thesis was about dystopian sci-fi, so I get a bit excited and carried away. I could probably talk for hours on it, but I won't do that to you. Okay, a few more things that I want to touch on. Okay, we've got a little bit more time. Any other observations that any of you had about the text? Because I want to, while you're thinking about that, feel free to interrupt me anytime, please. I like this. Yeah,
Sorry,
go. Is
hold
that
on.
Michael?
And I notice like how like the meaning of the text like is still timeless. Like where like it's written, you said, in 1950, and it's still relevant to today and to modern society's issues and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you think it's relevant? Like, if you read this, and you can feel free to each of you put something forward, but what do you find relevant about it? Or, you know, what do you think what do you think we need to critique as a society, as individuals living now, about the way people behave and interact with technology, if anything? Any ideas? What is so relevant about this? I mean, obviously, yeah, social media and its impact on the way we interact with it. Yeah. I think the way as well that people construct their identities, I think that's different. I mean, clearly in this short story, people are constructing their lives, you know, and their identities around these technological devices. And I think that if people are not careful, can become a little bit of the, you know, a chicken or the egg, what came first, the chicken or the egg. You know, sometimes, you know, you'll see people that are, you know, say an Instagram influencer, you know, and sometimes, you know, that when people say, you know, did it really happen if you didn't Instagram about it? You know, sometimes you get the sense that people, you know, going out of their way to do certain activities or to go to certain places, you know, so they can get the photo, you know, or they won't eat their meal unless they've taken a photo of it. You know, it's like it's almost like experiences don't have as much meaning if we can't share them and show them and record them in some way. And, you know, how does that you know, shape the way that we interact with each other, the way that we live our lives as well. So I think he's, you know, inviting us to question the way that we live our lives and the way that it affects our identity and our behaviors, you know, when we become one with technology, because it is so difficult in this day and age. I don't know if that's what you found relevant about this, but to avoid technology, it's all pervasive. It sort of invades so many facets of our lives these days. Feel free to interrupt me again if you need to, but if you want to, if you've got any other observations, I just want to point out when it comes to the figurative language, I really like this passage here. He came to a cloverleaf intersection which stood silent, where two main highways crossed the town during the day. It was a thunderous surge of cars, the gas stations open, a great insect rustling and ceaseless jockeying for position as the scarab beetles, the faint incense puttering from their exhaust, skimmed homeward to the far directions. But now these highways too were like streams in a dry season, all stone and bed and moon radiance. You could write a paragraph just about that. You've got you know, the metaphor of the great insect rustling. You know, it's almost like looking down on the highway and the intersection and all the cars moving as this big insect, which also has a bit of a dehumanizing, and like much of the imagery in this, it's reducing human beings and the way that they're moving around and functioning and behaving to something subhuman, something other than human. And the cars as scarab beetles as well. You know, it's like a sense of detachment and monotony. People are just going about their lives in a way that's not particularly human and connected. And the idea that they're all sort of in their own little individual pods as well. And then they're in their oh, oh, thank you for that. I didn't even know you could do that. That's pretty funny. Thank you. Yeah, so I think there's so many, like there's people in their tombs and there's people in their little scarab beetle cars. I think this kind of repetition of these kind of symbols is also interesting as well to analyze. You know, there's that isolation, that sense of detachment. And then so we don't just have Leonard as this solitary outsider figure. The humans themselves living in this society are also isolated and solitary. They're living their own little separate lives that are completely devoid of real connection. And even I really loved the line as well, where he said about the light doesn't even really touch their face. So they think they're connected to the television screen, but it doesn't quite reach them. So it's almost like there's this sense of disconnect even there as well. They will never actually access any kind of real and meaningful connection through the screen, even though they think that it has given them everything they need to function as a human. Okay, so I could keep going and picking this apart, but I'll let you, there's heaps of dialogue here, obviously, as well. Dialogue is a big one. And, you know, that short, sharp, you know, heavily punctuated lines where he's actually talking to a car with no inhabitants. So I think this is where it becomes even more sci-fi. There's not even a need for a real human here. And so how can you even communicate and reason with, you know, a technologized authority figure that lacks any compassion and empathy? You can't actually reason on a human level. It's futile. It's the futility of individual resistance in a society where humanity and compassion and empathy, you know, have been sucked out. There's no point reasoning with that kind of authority figure. It's like in 1984 as well, it's this futility of individual resistance and individual protest when you're in that kind of social regime. It's almost pointless. And he's trying to protest, but there's no use because they just keep that hard line of, you know, Mr. Mead, you know, why are you doing this? And there's no, it's a technologized car, you know, police authority figure. And he's, you know, saying that I'm just out walking. I need to see, you know, I want to breathe. And, you know, how can it possibly fathom and understand that? So you're getting this kind of, detached logic from the police car. So you could also analyze that, the symbol of this kind of, logical, empathyless authority figure. Okay, so plenty to analyze in this text. I'm sure I've given you lots of ideas, and I will fill in this 10-step analysis notes section as well. If you need to leave at 3:30, feel free to do so, but I'll just be another few minutes. I just want to wrap up and introduce the paragraph structure and then the creative writing task. It won't take long. Any questions on the text or anything you want me to clarify before I quickly go through these tasks? All good. Feel free to pop it in the chat or speak up if you've got any questions, please. So let's have a look first at the body paragraph structure. So again, like last week, because it's a Mod C HSC text, you have the option, you can do both if you want. If you're really enthusiastic, I will mark both. I will meet you at your level of enthusiasm. But yeah, or you can just do one or the other, depending on what you want to work on. If you want to work on more creative and reflective, then you can do that task instead. So I've given you a breakdown. Let me just read out the paragraph to you, the sample paragraph. So the focus question, I read that out before. How does it engage readers in social commentary on human behaviors? So the sample paragraph I've given here, the topic sentence, Bradbury's The Pedestrian effectively engages readers in social commentary on human behaviours through its depiction of a society consumed by technology and conformity. And then you can have a go below. In the context of the 1950s, when The Pedestrian was written, Bradbury was reacting to the increasing influence of television and the growing trend towards conformity in American society. His audience would have been familiar with these changes and the anxieties they brought. So just a sentence or two there before you go into your analysis of sort of the, why did he write this text? Why was it relevant? And even perhaps a little bit of personal interpretation of why does it still resonate today? That's a good spot for it after your topic sentence before you start your analysis. This is sort of like, what are we talking about in the topic sentence? Why are we talking about it? Why is it so important in relation to the author's context, values, audience, and purpose? You don't have to do all of those 4 things, by the way, but that's just some guidance on what you can talk about in these couple of sentences. Then we've got your TEALs, your technique, example, explain, effect, link back to the question, tried and tested structure for providing analysis. You don't have to have all of these steps. This makes for really strong, detailed analysis. The very base level, I would have a specific literary technique. You must have an example in the form of a quote, and you must explain the effect with some kind of a link back to the question, the focus question. So, and that could be done in one sentence. Okay, you could just say, Bradbury uses dialogue in "Hello there," he whispered to every house on every side as he moved, to reveal the lack of meaningful human interaction in the society he portrays. That's a teal. And that links to the question implicitly. I would take that a step further and provide a little bit more explanation of the effect and evaluation, but that's like a kind of B-range teal right there. Then the explain effect part, explain how the identified technique shapes meaning. This shows how disconnected people have become, communicating more with their machines than with each other, underscoring the superficiality of human relationships in this society. You can offer some evaluation if you haven't done already, where you're making some kind of value judgment on how effective this technique or this quote is in conveying the message of the author. So, for example, this dialogue is a powerful tool for Bradbury as it effectively conveys or powerfully conveys his message about the alienating effects of technology on humanity. If that already hasn't done enough to link back to the question and answer it, I think you already have. In your mind, think, have I linked this back to the question implicitly or explicitly briefly or in detail. And if you haven't, then just think, how can I connect this teal back to the question? This does not have to be a whole nother sentence by any means. It can just be, you know, link it back to the question in a couple of words even. It's just, you know, training your brain when you're analysing and writing these body paragraphs to think, because that's, as a HSC marker, for example, you've got these little, not that this is all about getting marks in your HSC, no, like I'm very passionate about literature in general, and I want to convey that to my students. It's not about marks and results necessarily, but writing essays is about, you know, in a lot of ways about that when you get into year 11 and 12. So as a little checklist, as a HSC marker in our mind, we're sort of conditioned as English teachers to reward these aspects in a teal, you know, in a body paragraph. It has to have a clear topic sentence that answers the question. It has to have some contextual detail, the why. It needs to be purposeful, touch on the author's values and purpose a little bit. And then it has to do this maybe 3 times in each body paragraph where it does this process. So I'm just really giving you an explicit outline so that when an English teacher is marking one of your essays, in their mind, they're going tick, 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 or they're even on the paper, tick, tick, tick. You're giving them what they're looking for, what we're trained to look for when we're marking. So this is why I spell this out each week, because trust me, week in, week out, for the last 22, 23 years, I've been marking HSC essays for students. And as much as we work through this process, students that have been doing it week in, week out still don't necessarily provide these nuts and bolts in their body paragraphs. So I will keep hitting you over the head with it until I see that, you know, you're doing it without thinking twice. So yeah, link back to the question. I've got an example there of how you can do that. And then here's your room here for doing your teals. And then I've also got a sample concluding statement there. Provide a concluding sentence that reinforces the main idea of the paragraph. So for example, Bradbury's satirical prose effectively engages readers in his social commentary on human behaviours, highlighting the dangers of a society that values technology and conformity over individuality and human connection. So that's just an example, explicitly linking it back to that question, another big tick. Okay, so that's option 1. And then I'll quickly go through this. This won't take as long. Any questions on the body paragraph structure? Please feel free to have a go. Take advantage of the fact that I'm offering free feedback, because usually I charge $80 an hour for that. But for this course, I'm doing it for free. Yeah, so feel free to take full advantage, because I will give detailed feedback. Okay, no questions. I'll move on. Creative writing and reflection task. So this mirrors the type of task that you would do in Mod C in Year 12, the craft of writing module. And this is a text on that module, as I mentioned earlier. So yeah, if you're heading towards Year 12 or you're in Year 12, definitely feel free to have a go of this task. It's exactly what you would be asked to do in the HSC. Okay, so the analytical task, this is just to set you up. You wouldn't be asked to do this in the HSC. This would be more like a preparatory class task once you've read the text, and then they're getting you to think about the stylistic features that you could use in your own piece of creative writing. So the whole purpose of Mod C is to get you picking apart a great work of literature and thinking about the stylistic features that are used in that work, and thinking, well, how can I employ those techniques in my own writing to strengthen my own imaginative responses? So in light of that, I've set you up to identify 3 key stylistic features. It could be, for example, narrative voice, the third person omniscient. You could adopt that. Symbolic characterization. You could, use some similes, metaphors, or personification, or other forms of figurative language or imagery, or the dialogue, for example, among others. So you could pick 3 of those, and then in your creative writing piece, then you can have a go of using those. So I've got a little brainstorming thing there, little box that you can brainstorm your ideas once you've chosen your 3 stylistic features and examples. The task is, for the creative piece, use the following quote from the Pedestrian as a stimulus for your creative response. He stood entranced, not unlike a night moth, stunned by the illumination and then drawn toward it. So this imagery is, somebody has seen something that they feel drawn towards. Doesn't have to be a police car like it was. It doesn't even have to use that quote explicitly and directly like that. Doesn't have to be a male, but you can use it as a stimulus. So it doesn't mean you have to use that quote in your piece exactly. It's more that you could use the idea, if you want, of someone being intrigued or their imagination captured by something, and they feel really drawn towards it and compelled to move towards something. It could be drawn towards a person, or it's open to interpretation. This is just being used as a stimulus. And then you use your 3 chosen stylistic features in your response and 1 key idea from the short story. So for example, you could write about a character who experiences a sense of isolation, alienation, or exclusion as a social outsider. Then you've got these ideas of alienation and exclusion. You could do the symbolic characterization, a little bit of dialogue, and some figurative language. You've done all 3 and you've answered the question. So I hope that any questions on that? Does that make sense? Space there for you to write your response. It doesn't have to be long. It's only, I've said, 250 to 300 words. It's just a snippet, just to give you that experience of trying to experiment with those stylistic features. And really common now in this module and in earlier modules is a reflection task. So getting you to reflect on how you've incorporated those ideas and those stylistic elements in your work. Use specific examples to show what you've done. So you can, I was influenced by this aspect of this stylistic feature in Bradbury's work, example. This is what I did with it. And here's an example from my work, and reflect on what you did and why you did it. Why did you make that choice? And then you've got space there for reflection. And if anybody wants more guidance on reflective writing, I would also happily, run a class on, I'm thinking about running a class in the not too distant future on persuasive, reflective, and discursive writing as well. So yeah, I'll let you know when I'm going to run those classes. Okay, that brings us to, I didn't go too much over time, but thank you for sticking around. Any questions on anything covered today? Is that all clear? I feel like I just spoke about 40,000 words. All good? Okay. Well, thank you for joining me. I will let you go. Please have a go of the activity.